Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hey everyone, it's Susan Kaufman, and you are listening to Attitude Magazine's ADHD Experts Audio. We are very pleased to have back Dr. Theresa Maitland to talk about college, specifically how to help your teen with ADHD or a learning disability handle the responsibilities of college life. Dr. Maitland is a senior ADHD LD specialist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the author of several wonderful books about college success for teens with disabilities, including Coaching College Students with ADHD and, more recently, Ready for Takeoff, Preparing Teens with ADHD and LD for College. Some of the topics that she'll be talking about are how to recognize the common pitfalls of parenting a teen with ADHD, LD, what the value is and why you should consider a coaching or a collaborative style with your teen and how to implement such a style, and the real importance of teen self-advocacy, a skill that your teen and adolescent needs to learn for life success and college success especially. Before we get started, I'd like to extend a big thank you to the sponsor of this week's Attitude webinar, the American Psychological Association. They are the publishers of a wealth of resources for the ADHD community, including professional books for practitioners, self-help books for children published under the Imagination Press imprint, and adult self-help and parenting books under the APA Life Tools imprint. They are the publishers of Dr. Maitland's recent book, Ready for Takeoff, Preparing Teens with ADHD and LD for College. And if you'd like to see a full selection of the books that the APA has published, including Dr. Maitland's book, please go to www.apa.org. They really are a font of information. So thank you, American Psychological Association. With that, let me turn it over to Dr. Maitland with our thanks.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Susan, and I'd like to thank everybody at Attitude, including Wayne and Stuart and Kate, who have helped me get ready for this. And I really would like to thank all of you who are taking the time out of your busy lives to spend this hour with me. Talking and writing and thinking about how we can empower teens with these differences to be more successful has become my passion. And it's grown out of a lot. I am a direct service provider on a college campus, and every year I get to meet transitioning teens with these differences. And what has inspired me to actually write about this and even provide the content of this webinar is the stories I hear from them. Because every semester I meet young people who are really ready. They would say it's not easy, but they're ready. And then I meet young people who aren't. And my curiosity has always taken me to go to the experts, and it's them, and interview them and try to find out what's gone on differently for the people who come here and sort of fall apart, and the people who come here and even though they're challenged, they rise to the occasion. And that's what I'm sharing with you today. My goal would be, I understand that, having a young person with these differences is really challenging, and parents put a lot of time and effort into making sure they have all the right services at the school, tutors, medication, SAT prep courses. And what we're going to talk about today are the things that you have the most control over, your interactions with your teen, and help you look at, are you interacting in a pattern that's promoting empowerment, or are you unconsciously not really realizing that you're interacting in a way that might be part of the problem? So I always tell the students I meet that the 21st century is a great time to be alive as a young person with these differences. I've been in the field since it started and opened one of the first LD classes in the country. And back then in the 70s and 80s, nobody was talking about college for this population. Many parents were discouraged because many of the school districts weren't even encouraging high school programming and high school graduation. So we know from research that half of the students who are diagnosed and receive services in college are going on to some post-secondary setting, either a 2-year or 4-year. For the past several decades, students with these diagnoses have been and continue to be the largest and fastest growing group of students with disabilities on college campuses. And because of the laws since the 90s, right, colleges are mandated to provide reasonable accommodations to this population. And many colleges are going beyond that, like the college that I represent. Many colleges are really committed to retention issues for all students, and they realize that this is a huge transition for everybody, especially those with these differences. And there's a whole host of other resources that are growing all over the country. I won't bore you with all the details of research, but I do want to say that there are studies that have shown that this population can be very successful at college. I was a collaborator on a big study a couple years ago with students at my university, and we found that a large number, 50% of the students we studied out of a sample of 2,000, had patterns of performance that were similar to the 9,000 students in the random sample who didn't disclose disabilities. They graduated in 4 years. They had 3.0 GPAs. They didn't have any unusual enrollment patterns. And I realize I'm at a high achieving school, but other people have also studied this population and found that if they access resources, they appear to be able to be successful. And even though I say that, I want to say there are a bunch of students out there that we never study because they never come forward. And you may have some of these students who have been raised with these differences and they know who they are and what they need. And they may be very successful, and researchers never can even count them because they don't even come forward for disclosure. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy. Of those 50% of the students in our population, I think each one of them would say to you the challenge has been significant. But there are also, in even our study, if 50% had really typical college experiences, 50% did not. And there are a number of studies out there that say because of these diagnoses and the differences that underlie them, students that are diagnosed with these hidden disabilities are at greater risk for academic, social, and emotional problems. They may actually have more semesters where they're on probation or ineligible, and they may have times where they have to stop and start so that their graduation rates may be affected. For example, Susan and I were talking before the webinar. When we studied our population, we found that many students had really great 5, 6, 8, and 10-year graduation rates. But I don't think anybody's sending their teen to college thinking it's going to take 10 years. That doesn't mean those young people were enrolled consecutively, because oftentimes things come to a crisis point, and if the university doesn't say you're ineligible, many times the students withdraw themselves because either their emotional issues have come down on them and they can't, and they're trying to avoid failure. So sometimes people do not graduate in 4 years. Our studies and others have found that it's not unusual for them to take 2 or 3 more semesters, and that doesn't include going to summer school a lot. And why might that be? You know, you probably have young people in college and you can predict. Handling a course load of 15 hours is a lot for any student, but if you have these differences, sometimes you can't do that, and you have to take the smallest number of classes because you have to compensate for your differences and still be full-time. You know, the earlier slide that I showed suggests that if they use resources, it appears they're more likely to be successful. Well, on the flip side of that, there's actually a huge national study called the National Longitudinal Transition 2 study that has followed students with all sorts of disabilities to college. And when they looked at what % of them actually register and use resources, the number is startling. These studies have shown that only 20% of the students who left high school having gotten services officially access them at the college level. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That could be another webinar. So even though they could be successful, they're notorious for not using resources. And why might that be? Many of you have lived the stories that I'm telling, and you could probably talk more eloquently about this slide. We know that there are factors within these students that put them at risk, that make the academic expectations at the college level more challenging. But certainly the self-management expectations that are suddenly thrust on them if they're at a 4-year college where they're living away from home put great demands on their executive functioning skills, their problem-solving skills, and their self-advocacy skills. And what we want to focus more on today is what are the environmental factors that we might have control over that may also be contributing to their lack of readiness and their lack of success. Last week, I had 3 or 4 first-year students coming for appointments, which is outstanding. In the 3rd week of class, I'm meeting more and more proactive young people, and their parents have done a great job getting them ready. But all 3 of them were blown away at how they had to structure themselves in all areas of their life. So if you just think about the dramatic difference between high school and college, again, a 4-year college where you're living away from home, many times high school doesn't take a lot of executive functioning. Everything's structured, there's daily homework, the teachers are organizing the learning, quizzes and frequent tests. And one young woman sat in my office in tears saying, you know what, I was a 3-sport athlete. I only had an hour and a half every night, and I knew I had to do my work during that time. It was no time management. Now I have these gaps of 4 hours and evenings, and I have to all of a sudden structure everything, including my learning, because the professors are expecting us to teach ourselves. There are a lot of hidden supports, and that's what we want to flesh out. Like, what are the hidden supports that make these 2 puzzle pieces fit together when it's not positive? Certainly in high school, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, there are accommodations and flexibility and adjustments that may not follow a young person to college. For example, I do meet students still who have had the accommodation of being able to take their tests twice and average their grades, or they've never been downgraded for spelling. And at a college level, some of those same accommodations are not necessarily going to fly because of the differences in the law. And then what we're really going to focus on is oftentimes people, the parents and the young people themselves, don't realize the hidden multiple ways that parents or family members were filling the gaps for executive functioning, problem solving, and self-determination. And this leads us to talk about how might parents of individuals with these differences unwittingly fall into traps and pitfalls that could work in the short run, but if they're not fated, they could backfire in the long run. I was blessed to collaborate with Dr. Patricia Quinn on the books that Susan mentioned. And when she and I put our heads together, she had hundreds and hundreds of families she worked with in a pediatric practice. And prior to working at this university, I had 10 years in a private clinical setting. And we also had our own life experiences because we all have relatives with these differences. And what we came up with in a light way to try to help families look at their patterns is 3 categories. There's probably many more. And as the picture in the center is trying to communicate that oftentimes individuals with these executive functioning and problem solving and self-advocacy differences, they almost invite us to give more help than is useful, because it's so hard for them to think for themselves. So on the left part of your screen, we named one category of parenting traps or pitfalls as parents or teachers or professionals who act as directors. Directors are usually people who have well-developed executive functioning skills and planning skills and time management skills, and they may not really realize that they're really just naturally filling in the gaps for their young person. I meet students who have said to me, I got through high school because my mother was my frontal lobe because she's so good at planning, juggling, seeing all my assignments, telling me what to do. Similarly, if it's teaching somebody how to clean their room or take their medicine, oftentimes people who are directors just have all the solutions and they just give them. And if you have somebody who isn't resistant to that and they have trouble thinking of their own, it can certainly get through avoiding a lot of problems in the short run, but you can see if we play it out what that might create in the long run. Another role we sometimes see families play, and as I said, Dr. Quinn and I felt like we fall in all of these categories, so we're not being judgmental, is parent repairment. So if a problem shows up, oftentimes families, to protect the fragile self-esteem of their young person with these differences will come to the rescue with a toolbox full of solutions to either get rid of the consequences of that problem or to make sure it never happens again. Again, for example, if somebody failed a test and they hadn't had adequate preparation, families might go lobby in the school, as I said to you, to be able to retake a test. Not too many colleges will allow that. Or simpler things, like imagine somebody has trouble getting their books and assignments back and forth from high school. How many of you have had to drive back to the school as it's about to be locked by the janitor and let your young person get their books? And some may have actually asked the school for a different set of books. Again, while that might get through the problem in the short run and make life easier, it doesn't teach the skills of organizing your materials and thinking through things. And finally, many of these students would not be where they were if their parents didn't act as powerful ninja warriors in their families and in the school. Knowing what the young person's rights are, lobbying and advocating, and making sure every accommodation that can be provided by law is provided. And if I step back, I want to make sure that you're hearing the spirit in which we're saying this. We do understand that many of the young people who are getting to college would never get there if adults in their lives didn't play some of these roles. The real danger is when we don't slowly, deliberately fade these roles so the young person can do these things for themselves. To make this all more clear to you, one of the goals of the webinar was to let you more objectively assess your parenting style. And certainly there are many enlightened people who have personalities might be different than mine. Maybe you're not control freak like I am. And you've learned you don't fall into a pattern that could be non-productive. But we want to give you a chance to really honestly look at a situation. And the reason I want to say this, too, is just research on parenting practices at the college level and at all levels has said that there's no relationship more powerful for either limiting or promoting self-determination than that of a parent. And I'm quoting experts who have studied self-determination, Ryan and DC and Dr. Field and Waymeyer, and that we can't underestimate the role that a parent could play at either facilitating and empowering someone or hampering that. So you all saw this little scenario. When I had a rich, busy private practice of teenagers, this scenario came up a lot. And each time I use this in actual live workshops where I'm in person, there's always some in the audience who just lived this scenario yesterday. So as you're reading it, I'll just say it out loud. So imagine your teen comes to you after dinner and asks you to contact their history teacher, and they're sort of in a panic. There's a paper due tomorrow at 9, and they haven't completed it. And if you understand individualized educational plans and 504 plans, imagine there is an option for extensions. So what might you do? And hopefully, as you look at your response to this, it's going to help you see, are you already on the path to empowerment, or are you needing to really rethink the way you're living with your young person? So we're going to look at the opposite of empowering responses. It's what Dr. Quinn and I and the literature out there has called enabling responses. Those of you familiar with the addiction world and the 12-step world may be familiar with this term as it relates to addiction. Certainly, organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon have uncovered that whenever there's somebody with a problem, there's actually people in the family or in the relationships around that person that are responding in a way that's enabling the destructive pattern to stay in place. So I picked two definitions, Wikipedia, and then in the resource list that you'll be able to download, there's a very neat pamphlet that's published by Hazelton, which is the biggest publishing house of addiction literature. And this very inexpensive pamphlet has actually applied this concept to parenting. So Wikipedia points out that enabling responses are dysfunctional patterns that are designed to resolve a problem, like going back to get the books if your young person forgot them, but may actually exacerbate it. And typically what's happening is another party with the best of intentions, love and support, could shield the individual from any awareness that there is a problem and consequences of their action, and then lower the potential of that person's need for change. The pamphlet I described has a very similar definition. The idea of like well-meaning adults who unintentionally encourage dependent or irresponsible or self-destructive behavior. My favorite line in this that is a little different, later in the pamphlet, they say enabling is actually doing something for someone that he or she should do for themselves. And this is where I just want to make mention of what the research has said about this type of pattern and how it might impact college students. And I do want to point out a book on your resource list that's come out this summer called Becoming Self-Determined, Creating Thoughtful Learners in a Standards-Driven Admission-Frenzied Culture. I was very blessed to be invited to do a chapter on the role of parents, and it made me look at the research on parenting. And I won't bore you with all the details, but people have actually studied these patterns, which the society has now come to call helicopter parenting or concierge parenting. The research calls it overparenting versus enabling. And they talk about that oftentimes if a family is supportive, but they overparent. And what that means is they cross the and they take ownership for the problem, and they give solutions. They don't give choice to the young person, and sometimes they might actually get involved and solve the problem. That there is some research that's showing that that is linked in college students with and without disabilities to less well-being. They report that they are less happy with college life, less well-being, less engagement, increased depression and anxiety, and overall lack of confidence in their own ability to handle things. People who have studied this say that that's because this dysfunctional pattern thwarts the young person's ability to become autonomous and grow their own competency in certain situations. And again, everyone understands that this might be done for well-meaning reasons, not intentionally. And you think of the old adage, we could either give a person a fish or teach them to fish. An overparenting or enabling response gives them the fish. So let's look at some of the enabling responses that could happen. And again, we don't want to have any judgment because people, I'm included in this, have probably done these responses, just trying to get through the day, protect self-esteem, not have a failure experience. But if we see them as dysfunctional patterns, let's look at them. So one option a person could have picked is drop everything and do what the student says, and email and text the history teacher. Since you do have that accommodation, you could activate it. Another option can be stay up late with the student, with your teen, and collaboratively kind of work on that paper, being a cheerleader. Yeah, you can get this done. I'll get you coffee, and I'll help you write it. I'll type it. You dictate it. You could agree to write a note and let your teen stay home tomorrow to finish the paper. Send them to bed and reassure them that you'll drive them to school. And in some extreme cases, I have had audience members tell me they did this. Like, you're just so frustrated and you want your young person to be successful, you could write the paper yourself. And of course, in a college level, that would be an honor code violation, not always uncovered in the high school world. Again, no judgment, but just looking at think about what these responses do. What do they teach? You know, they kind of teach that the environment will change to meet your needs, and it robs the person of the opportunity to kind of learn, like, how did this happen, and what can I do to avoid it? What we want to move into are more collaborative, empowering ways of responding. And I loved looking up these definitions because they really capture what we want for our young people. As an opposite to enabling, empowering responses actually give someone authority and power to make them stronger and more confident in controlling their lives. Isn't that really what we want? From the pamphlet that I mentioned, empowering in this pamphlet, they define it as actively teaching children or teens to take responsibility for their choices, be accountable for their actions. And what I didn't include is to learn from the consequences of the choices they made. And again, just to briefly summarize the literature out there, people now are studying supportive but collaborative relationships, which are the opposite of what we talked about in the last slide, supportive but overparenting interactions. And just as it sounds, there's some research that suggests if the parent can shift to a partnership, a collaborative role, and give choice to the individual, that in ways that encourage them to make their own decisions, reflect on the outcomes, learn from consequences, research has suggested that this is actually the opposite. The outcomes in college students are better self-report of well-being, more engaged on campus, less anxiety and depression, and more independence. When Dr. Quinn and I wrote the book Ready for Takeoff, we captured what we thought was a great approach to parenting called the coach approach. Now that I compare it to the research I've read, it's kind of a naturally empowering method. And again, for some of you, this might be how you parent because this is how you move in the world as more of a collaborator. And for others, this is a stretch. We borrowed this concept from the coaching field, but it's all based on the sports coaching model. And I really like that metaphor if we take it. Think about this. The best sports coach you've ever seen is never in the game. They do a lot of interaction before the game. They're on the sidelines being there for the player during the game. And after the game, they help the player learn from the experience. But even the most extreme coaches never jump in the game and grab the ball. So this metaphor helps you keep clear that it's not your game, it's their game. And to take a coach approach takes a big shift in belief systems. It's not viewing your teen with learning and attentional disabilities as broken or unable to handle their lives, but actually seeing them in a very empowered light as experts on their own life who might have ideas and solutions, and they can learn to overcome some of their limitations. We don't always have to accommodate for them. This approach also takes a long-term view that allows for failure, whether that's your first B or an actual F, or you don't get the paper on time, but seeing failure as a chance to grow and not be self-incriminating about it and to learn from it. It takes different interaction style. It's not the director style or the parent repairman. It's a more passive but active listening, curiously without judgment. And the role in a coach approach is to not to tell people what to do, but to ask really great questions that get the person's executive functioning skills and problem-solving skills to access their own wisdom. When ideas are shared, they're seen as suggestions. They're not the right way. This is not what you have to do. I have the suggestion. And it allows for the young adult to design the kind of support they need from their adults in their lives. And the adult is actually managing to not take over. So if we look at, I'm having trouble forwarding my slide. There we go. How might that play out? And some of you may have had these responses and some others that I didn't think about. An empowering collaborative response might be that when your teen comes to you, you stop with the dishes or whatever you're doing and you sit down and say, wow, talk to me. I can see this is really upsetting to you. Being empathetic, but not crossing the line and saying, I'm happy to help you problem solve what's possible. I am not willing to contact your teacher at this point because you're going to college in a few months and I want you to learn how to do these things. Asking open-ended questions. This happened to you last year in science when you delayed doing a project. How'd you handle it? What do you think your options are? And how can I support you? We're going to jump from those later questions to offering suggestions. Like, may I share an idea? You have some outlines? They look really good. What if you use that dictation software I saw you use on your tech messaging and you just talked it out and then you could edit it? Or what do you think about emailing your teacher right now? I'll help you create it and you could say, own that you're not ready and say what would be the reduction in points you might get or ask for a meeting for tomorrow so you could explain what happened. And certainly after the fact, I always say these learning questions are not helpful when somebody's in a crisis. But maybe the next day or on the weekend to say, let's have a discussion to really look at, how did this happen? I'm not judging you. I'm trying to be curious. Like, how did this happen? What can we do to prevent it in the future? And what role can I play? So you look at these responses and see, yeah, you're opening the door for a consequence. However, you're potentially involving your young person in all those definitions of empowering that we looked at, learning from the choices and really learning from the past and applying it to the future. Empowering students is not just related to how we interact, but it's also being really deliberate about college readiness. As I said to you, the young people I meet who come to college more prepared, I would say 100% of them that I interviewed tell me at some point their parents decided that they had to take ownership for some of the roles that the parents were playing. And I think in my experience, and it's not a structured study, it's people who are not just thinking short run, but thinking long run. And you can, if you haven't done this, you could do this with your teen. The books we created some readiness checklists to help parents and psychologists and teachers have these dialogues, but you can have an open dialogue if your young person will talk to you. And it really doesn't matter. It's just deciding together that here's a place where you're over relying on me, and I won't be there when you're in college. And how could we slowly transfer this as something you can do? I realize that not all families can have this kind of discussion with their young person, and they might need a third party to facilitate this discussion. And that could be an older sibling who's gone to college, a cousin, a pastor at a church, a high school counselor, or a professional in your community. How might that look? As Susan said, I want to mention and highlight the skill of self-advocacy. Because, again, the research on looking at successful students with ADHD and LD has suggested that those who come to college, having already practiced saying what their needs are, asking for help and using resources, are more likely to use resources on college campuses, which sets them up for success. So this has come from my work years ago with one family that made the decision junior year, the fall of junior year, that they were going to start fading their role in the school and inviting the young person with the goal that by the end of junior year and ready for senior year, the young person would handle all their own interactions in the school. And that parents by the end of junior year would no longer be the primary communicator, but would always be there to coach the teen to take over these roles. How might we get there? You know, in the fall, the teen might be invited to you have to come to every school-related meeting that occurs, that whether it's a formalized one like an IEP or your teacher in English wants to meet with me. And this would mean teachers would have to also start thinking not to always contact the parent, but to invite the teen. If calls come or emails slowly in the fall, the parent would make the commitment to always invite the young person to be a part of those and to carbon copy them. And the parent's role shifts to, prior to each meeting, having a powwow, sort of like the pre-game training that a coach does. All right, we're going for that meeting. Here's what they might ask you. What might you say? What role do you want me to play? This kind of personalized, slow fading of the parent can be done on any skill, from taking your medicine to waking up to washing laundry. So as you listen to this, and I hope the questions are coming in, I'd want each of you, even those who don't ask questions, to think about, what are your top takeaways from this? Are you already on the path to empowering, or do you need to make a big shift? How would you like to apply these ideas in your daily life? And what are the immediate next steps? And what resources do you need so that you can do this? I want to invite people to be aware that there will be a free webinar that's almost a half day. That will be a webinar and a seminar where Dr. Quinn is speaking on this topic on November 18th. If you live in Chapel Hill, you can come in person. If you want the webinar version, you can register. And I've been told by the folks handling this that the registration sites for both should be set up by next week. Let me stop right there and turn it over to Susan for questions.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. I have a question which hasn't been posed by anyone who's posted, but is one that occurs to me from as a result of listening to so many experts and hearing the questions from the readers at Attitude. We tell readers, or experts tell readers, that they shouldn't assume that their child is at the same developmental level as children without ADHD or learning disabilities, and that oftentimes they should think of them as 3 years or 3 to 5 years behind. And parents oftentimes are really coached to stay involved and do more than feels natural, not to walk away and leave their child. How does the parent know? What are some ways a parent can know when the right time to start stepping back is?
That's an excellent question.
I think it's just so tough for all of everyone who has a child who needs more help than one would normally expect in any event.
Definitely. And I think when, the idea of either over-parenting or letting go is where many families have lived. It's so frustrating because if you let go, they don't learn, right? And that's where I think inviting the young person to be in dialogue with you, you can't turn over everything at one time. And they aren't ready. And let me give you an example. I've had students again this semester here in my office crying and saying, not only do I have to learn how to handle harder academics and take my own medicine, now I have to wash my own clothes. I can't handle it all, right? So I think the first thought that comes to me is we're not saying that you let go. In fact, that's the opposite of what we're saying. In the book, we use the metaphor ready for takeoff because the way we saw it, nobody lets a pilot fly without a training school. So we want to be a partner with our young people and get their input on where do they want us still to take the lead and where can we start shifting responsibility and do it in a slow, deliberate way with their input. And let me give an example, Susan, from the research. I was surprised to see that some of the research has found that if parents push a young person to be independent when they really still want help, that's not empowering them. That the whole key is to ask them, what role do you need me to play right now in helping you with your medicine?
I think that's a huge insight, that there's something between doing everything and doing nothing. That you have to embrace that interim stage where you're transitioning and not doing everything, but not just walk away, which is, I think that's the tough part, right? Yeah.
That's where we thought, this coaching and what the literature is calling this collaborative approach, it can go on in college. I mean, any student I meet, even when they're in college, I ask them what role their parent is playing and what role would they like them to play to support them as they learn self-control here. Some will say, I really do need my mom to text me at 8 o'clock every night to see if I'm doing my homework. Well, let's ask her that. So what the literature is saying is it's all about choice. Okay. And it's not doing for them without asking them.
Got it. Okay, that's great. That's really insightful. So the key here is communicating, having the child speak up and say, yes, I want help on this, or no, I don't want help on that. That's interesting. What some of the people are posting, Carol and some of the other ones, is they have, teens that just reject help, just, want to be, quote, normal, don't want to be helped. Any advice for those folks? Let me hear someone. My brilliant team has chosen to reject help and is now home for a gap year and floundering and been letting go, but he does need help. So again, it sounds like Carol's in that situation between letting go and helping.
It's between a rock and a hard place, right?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Yeah.
I'm going to refer to what I've seen other families do. I guess the hard thing that I think you and I were talking about this, Susan, before the webinar, if a young person has not gone through their own grief cycle to accept their difference, sometimes there's nothing a parent can do because you've gone through the grief cycle and you accept their difference, but they don't. So it's really challenging. What I have seen other families do, like they sometimes need a third party to negotiate these things. But they may make an agreement that during your time, your gap year, or you flunked out of college, we're going to have to come to some agreement. And it's helpful if all parties in the family, the adults, agree to this so that the young person doesn't create a wedge between two partners or two parents. But they may say, while you're living at home, we need you to find a job. We need you to have therapy once a week or work with a coach once a week. Wherever you could give choice, we need you to be working on these things because they're not going to miraculously get fixed by taking time off. And give choice, get ideas. What are you willing to do? Are you willing to take a study skills class at a local university? It goes back to choice. And I hear the thing about normalcy. And
right.
Let me just say, one of the creative things that we've done here, but it's not happening in high schools or nationwide, is we put the resources in the normal place. Let me just say, our learning center is for any student on this campus. And you do not have to have a disability to use our learning center. Unfortunately, in the high schools, the resources tend to always be targeted to a problem or a disability. We're trying to create a culture that it's normal to use resources. And for some students, it's really important that they go to somebody who doesn't have ADHD or LD next to their name. I just had a mom from Boston who contacted me. She might be on the webinar, who said her young person will not go to an ADHD coach. Is there anybody that's more general for the whole population?
Right.
And I think
feeling normal, right?
Yes, and I think we've tried, and this has happened over the last several years. We've gone from offering coaching only to people with ADHD and LD, and we were in a disability center, and you had to disclose. We're now in a learning center where there's no disclosure. You just go online and make an appointment, and the people who have no disability can come for any of our services too. And what we're seeing is if we create it so it's normalized, then the people with a difference will come. But it's a challenge that we all have, like, what is normal, and isn't using resources normal? But I have seen families be somewhat successful by making an agreement, but giving their young person choice within that agreement.
Okay.
Like, if you don't want somebody who has I don't care. I mean, study skills are study skills, right? What are you willing to do? Like, we're expecting that you go back and you're successful. What do you think you need? And where could we find it that has nothing to do with disability?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the offering choice seems like a key. This is an interesting comment from someone. As a parent of a teen with ADHD, you also have to be prepared to redefine your own relationship with your child. My role has been being my child's ADHD coach for 15 years. I need to move on too. That's very insightful, don't you think? I mean, that's,
very much. Very much, because it really does mean that not only do they have to grow to acquire new roles, you have to figure out what's going to take that space that you've been playing, right?
Exactly, yeah. Someone here she is an academic coach at a university, and she has 2 students with ADHD who just aren't willing to take help despite failing miserably. What can I do? So she's not even a parent. She's a coach herself, probably more like your role.
Right. Well, let me just say, having just gone through this summer with someone that I work with, there's someone that I worked with who has been on probation 4 or 5 times, tried it again this summer and said he was going to come weekly because he knew it helped them. And I reached out, and he didn't come, and he became ineligible, and I don't think he can come back to this university.
Wow, yeah.
I think that's a dilemma that all of us on our campus talk about all the time. Like, where are we not in control? And the other view is, what if it's okay that the person doesn't go to college right now? I know failure is not something we want to promote, but I have definitely met students who would not use my help, who went in the world, who are in the 10-year graduation rate group, and they came back when they had their own children and they were ready to grow. It's having a different perspective and recognizing all you can do is ask the young person, so help me understand. what's going to be different for you, and what do you think you've learned from your probation experiences or your failure experiences, and tell me what's so bad about coming to me. Help me understand how you see that. But still, what I see for myself is there's a line where I can't learn for the young person.
Right. So at some point for this person who's an academic coach, there may be nothing further she can do, is what you're saying. And, that fits with the questions that some people are asking, are there kids who just aren't ready to go to college and should go to community college, live at home for a year? I mean, do you see kids?
Before I answer that, I'm sorry. I just want to go back to the person who's in my role. I always keep doors open, and I ask, can I stay in touch with you? Is it okay if I send you an email? And if you ever want to stop in and talk with me, it isn't unusual for us to meet somebody who was not ready 1 year, and they're dipping their toe in resistantly because their parent dragged them here. And because I tried to stay open, they'll show up 2 years later, and they are ready.
Right, yeah. So staying in touch, yeah.
And open and non-judgmental, if you can.
Yep.
Your question about is it possible that some people are just not ready for this kind of 4-year live on your own experience?
And how does a parent work with their child collaboratively to come to that conclusion when the pressure around them is so intense to go to high-achieving, academically prestigious colleges oftentimes?
I have not had that experience in my own family, but I have worked with lots of families. What I have seen some families do a really good job at is they would, prior to senior year, they would get clear on what do they need to see going on in the young person's life for them to fund a traditional college experience. And that might be in 9th grade or 8th grade or 10th grade. But I think that sometimes if the family can say, this is a big investment and we're willing to make it in you, and here's what we want to see, because we know it takes a lot of skills. The families that have done that and then their young person is not meeting the goals, they've had something then to turn to and say, that doesn't mean we won't fund you to go to a community college or have a gap year. Thinking of this as an investment, and also my experience is hope is not a plan, like hoping that the young person will get it together when all of a sudden they're thrown into all these expectations. In my experience, it's backfired. So I think sometimes families need a third party, like a psychologist or a counselor or somebody or a pastor to have this discussion. I have had young people be furious at their parents because they did not fund them to go away to college.
Wow.
Only to come back several years later saying, thanks, Mom and Dad. But during that year, it was not easy to be in that family.
Okay. So the people who consider delaying college if their children doesn't seem ready, seems like that's an important conversation to have.
But then what might they do in the interim? I mean, I have a young man right now whose family were not willing to fund him to go to college, but he did find a gap experience, which was almost like a Teach for America experience, but it was at a lower level. I've met students who, through their churches or through community organizations, did an experience. Some held jobs and worked with a coach or a therapist because that was part of the agreement for this gap experience.
Yeah, so one of the listeners said, I think you've just answered this question. What are your thoughts about taking a gap year in order to get some practice in self-management and daily living? Another person, though, has said, what about the lack of structure in a gap year? So I think what I hear you say is there needs to be structure in the gap year if you don't go to college. Right. Turning to disability centers, a number of people have asked questions such as, how do you identify a good disability center? What should you look for, and what kinds of support should you expect to find?
That's a really good question. And the resource sheet that I've given you lists, there's a K&W has a guide that pulls together information on colleges that have disability centers, and they rate them based on whether they're comprehensive or not. Sometimes those guides although that's the newest edition, they're out of date. I guess what I would encourage families to think about is don't just think disability center. Think whole college. What are all the resources?
Okay.
And certainly that guide, the KNW guide, might help you begin to narrow to some places. Certainly Chad, I know, has some information about colleges that have more resources. But ultimately, yes.
What's KNW, just to be clear?
You know what, I dropped my sheet of resources, so I can't.
I'll just
But on the resource list, there is something called the KNW guide for colleges for students with learning and attentional disabilities.
Great. Okay.
It's on the resource list.
Terrific.
As people begin to narrow down some colleges, I would want people to think broader, again, like what kind of resources are available on that campus for all students? Going back, if you fully understand that all a disability office is mandated to do is provide accommodations, they are not mandated to have coaches or study skill tutors. You want to really investigate a campus by looking at, is there a writing center for all people? Is there a learning center for all people? Is there a counseling center that provides support to all transitioning freshmen? And finding resources that don't require disclosure, given how sometimes these students don't want to disclose or they haven't accepted their difference, might really be helpful. So ultimately, it's a lot of hard work once you narrow to your top choices for you and your teen to go online and research these places and see what do they have. I've worked with families and students have made a grid. Okay, I'm looking for a college that has not just accommodations, but a learning center and coaches. And then go visit them and actually experience it and ask to talk to students who use those resources to get like a reality check.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a huge amount of sense because I do think just for my own two children who went to college, that the schools have many schools have more resources than others, and there's a big difference, I think. So it's definitely something to investigate. Interesting question here from Lori. How can a college student learn the other types of skills? Washing clothes, paying bills, learning finance. I'm guessing you're going to say that the time to start that is before they go to college, right?
Yes. I would think certainly within the family, if that's possible. Let me say we have gotten some feedback, Dr. Quinn and I, that some schools across the country have used our book On Your Own with their high school students who are having 504 plans or in LD classes, and they've actually used it to have students do their own college readiness assessment and set goals and then have to learn those daily living skills like washing clothes, taking your own medicine, waking yourself up. I think certainly a family can oversee that. I know that at the college level, that is not a resource other than our coaching. I don't see a lot of colleges that are providing a lot of work on daily living skills.
No.
They're sort of, although those are getting in the way for many students, our coaching model and many colleges that have coaching models that are holistic allow students to set goals, like, for example, waking yourself up for an 8 o'clock. If you have a sleep issue and your dad has always awakened you and nobody faded your dad, right? You have to develop that skill. So I would think in the classroom, if your student is getting some services, could you talk to the school about, is there any way that they could take on some of the discussion of college readiness as some of these creative schools have? Or how do you do it in your family? I guess from watching people just fall apart in my office, I see how unfair it is for us to send them here if they have to learn everything in August. If we could take on, one of my dreams has always been to use senior year to start transferring all the daily living skills slowly. And then last semester of senior year, since they're already accepted into colleges, and few colleges will revoke an admissions decision, you could actually pretend that you're in college. And I'm not going to wash your clothes, and I'm not going to wake you up, and I'm here to support you and help you and coach you. But let's do like a college trial, and see what skills you still need work on while I'm still here to help.
Is there, someone's asked, is there a checklist somewhere that they could use to review with their child to help decide if they're really ready to attend college on their own? I mean, there must be. Yeah.
Well, what Dr. Quinn and I did in both books is we did some research on what people in the literature have said are the common college readiness skills, and then we used our own experience, and we tried to create a college readiness checklist that has daily living skills, self-determination skills, and academic skills that could be used for exactly the reason that you're talking about, to have a discussion that's not emotional.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Interesting.
And there are others that can, if you do a search on college readiness skills, you might find Landmark College has a briefer version that might not be as comprehensive, but yes.
Okay, that's a cool. But I thank you to the person that suggested that, having a checklist, finding one, and we'll see if we can pull one together, perhaps, Dr. Maitland, with your information that we could make available. But your book is a great resource for everyone. So I want to thank everyone for coming today, especially you, Dr. Maitland, and all of the listeners. I think this is a topic that's way underexplored. And we sort of abandoned kids after high school levels. So I want to thank you and encourage everyone to read your books and to take this topic seriously. It's a life skills, right? We have so little time with our kids. It's amazing. So thanks, everyone, and we'll sign off now. Thanks again. See you next week, I hope.
Thank you.
Bye.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.